In the last video, we looked at a couple of the special articulations that Trillian offers, the round-robin sound sources and the legato sound sources. Well, there's a third special articulation, release noises, release sound sources. And what this does is emulate the sound that is made when a note is lifted off a string, once a note is finished being played on a bass. And we can adjust the level of the release noise here on the main patch page with this dial. It's a bit exaggerated, but you hear the sound of the note off, the finger being lifted off the string. But we can get into more detail and control the release sound sources from the sound source browser. So let's go to the edit page, and this is our clean Fender sound. I'm going to hit the sound source zoom, and we see here that for the special articulations, we can control the release samples here. So by default, this clean Fender full range is using the clean Fender release, but we can mix and match different release samples with the different main samples that are loaded in. We can adjust the release level here, and this just mirrors the control on the main page. So as I raise one, the other is mirrored. You just have finer control here because there are some other controls available. Now we have a transition time slider, and this controls the amount of time from the original sample being released until the release sample is triggered. Let's put it way up, and you'll hear a bit of overlap. When I lift my finger off the note, I'll show you the keyboard so you can see when I lift my finger off, you'll hear a bit of the sustain sample lingering over into the release sample. Versus a shorter transition time, which is a bit more natural. And we have release key tracking. Now, release sound sources are multi-sampled, round-robin available sound sources that will track each pitch. When you have this enabled, you get unique release samples for each pitch. So with the release level really high, let me play you a little part that uses two notes, and you'll hear the release notes track the pitch of the main note. And if I turn off tracking, we'll hear the same pitch release sample on each note. Always the same versus tracking the pitch of the principal note. Now, when we mix and match these release samples with the main sounds, we also have to be mindful of the edit page amp envelope release setting. Now, we haven't looked at this, but let me close this up for a moment. And we have in the envelope section here, we have an amp envelope. And what this means is that each note that sounds has an amplitude that's shaped over time. And these allow us to control the amplitude of the sound over time. For example, this controls the attack of the sound as the note is triggered, the attack of when the sample ramps up or how quickly it ramps up. And then we have the decay for how quickly it decays. And then the sustain level for when it decays, what level it sustains at. And then this is the important one for now, the release time. And you generally want this fairly high so that the release sample has enough time to play out. Even though they're very short, if you have this too low, we'll truncate it and cut it off. Let's try a little experiment. I'm going to initialize this patch, and it'll revert to a default sound, which is the synth sound source. Let's load in the sound source browser. That was the zoom. Let's go to the sound source browser and load in another sound. Let's try this one, Bass Station Acid Sweep. And let's go back to the edit page, and we'll try and load in some release samples with this. Now, by default, this is not going to have any release sample. Let's go into the zoom over here, and there's no sound source selected. Let's choose maybe the Chapman stick release, and I'll put the level way up. We're not really hearing anything. Let me put it down. I'll put it all the way up. We're not hearing anything, and that's because the release here is all the way down, so there's no time once I lift my finger off the note for that release sample to be heard. So let's lift this up. We'll boost it way up. That's much longer than is needed for a short release sound, but let's leave it up for now. And we'll go back to the sound source zoom, and now we'll hear it. So that's an interesting and unusual pairing, a synth bass with an electric bass release. And of course, tracking will work here as well, on or off. As will the transition time. And you'll hear the overlap now of the end of the sustain of the synth sound overlapping when the release of the Chapman stick comes in. And again, this is all dependent on the release times that's set here. If this is too low, we won't hear that overlap. So there you go. There's a little idea of how release samples work and how they can be used in Trillion. Stay tuned. See you for more in the next video.